In November 1942 we took part in heavy fighting between the Volga and the Don, on the left flank of Paulus's 6th Army. And by January 43 with the remnants of our regiment we reached Stalingrad. Our last positions, which were on the western outskirts of the city, we held until January 10, before the beginning of the Russian offensive. On that day they rolled over us and broke through the cauldron in several places like a deflated soccer ball. My regiment was practically wiped out. The situation became hopeless. It could last only a few days. Stalingrad at the end of January is 3 isolated cauldrons in a city shot to ruins. From the west the Russians had surrounded us, and from there they were advancing on our last positions. On the other side of the Volga began an endless, frozen steppe. The other 2 cauldrons were to the north, and our small one held on to the square in the center of Stalingrad. Here was the command center, from which the future Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus managed our last skirmish. During the day the fighting flared up and died down, but at night it was almost silent. The Russians, according to our first impression, did not want to risk and make unnecessary sacrifices and waited for these few days, which could still wait until the victory itself will not come to their hands. If they had wanted victory a week earlier, it would have come to them. Normal command was out of the question. The more incomprehensible was the discipline which the soldiers and officers continued to observe. There was not a hint of disintegration of the troops. There were practically no defectors. Except when the commanders themselves decided to end resistance in such a hopeless situation. But we didn't want to surrender. Russian captivity is certain death. That's what everyone said, and that's how it turned out in the end. We gathered again and again at the positions and said that we had 3 choices: captivity, suicide, or breakthrough. Not every suicide would be as desperately heroic as that committed by General Hartmann, who climbed out onto the berm of the front line of trenches and stood there for so long until he was shot. I didn't think of putting a bullet in my forehead. I thought I was going to break through. I asked my remaining subordinates, and both of my field officers came with me. A senior lieutenant from another division also joined. He heard us talking about it in the basement. If the Russians capture us in the rear, they'll finish us off. At Christmas we still believed that everything would be all right. There would be the long-awaited breakthrough to the southwest. It must be, we thought, when at night we saw the glow of explosions on the horizon. A whole army, 22 divisions, I said to myself, they cannot leave us to our fate. But from the beginning of the big Russian offensive on January 10th, our mood changed radically. No one will get us out of here. The blockade had failed. And for all the fear and despair, anger is growing. Many of us are sick, wounded, and for lack of food, weakened. Typhus is spreading, and lice is the most harmless thing there is. Only a few are taken out by airplanes, especially after the Russians took over the Potomnik airfield. From time to time German planes drop containers of ammunition and provisions over the cauldron. Most of them fall to the Russians, or disappear somewhere in the ruins. After all, the pilots don't know where we're hiding anymore. Sometimes a soldier stumbles across such a food bomb, and then comes the holiday feast. We still have the last working anti-aircraft searchlight. It stands at the command post, and every night it sticks its beam vertically into the sky, like a drowning man stretches out his hand. And Paulus seems to have resigned himself to it. I was twice at his command post, but I never got to see him myself. His Chief of General Staff Arthur Schmidt organizes everything for him. Here comes a field officer carrying 4 pairs of skis. We don't hesitate to ask where he got them. In the evening of January 29th we go out and immediately hit a minefield. Someone takes off. We are forced to abort our attempt. In the early evening of the 30th we set out again, going all night, going across the frozen Volga. We reach its eastern bank without any problems. Now we're in the rear of the front. During the day we hide in an empty Russian dugout. The second night we go up the river and back across the Volga to the western bank. The Russians take us prisoner in a gully near the village of Vinovka. We surrendered. One of the field officers was wounded in the head by a fragment of a hand grenade. With a certain sense of pride they take us through the village as a trophy. One of the rear units is just standing there. The male and female soldiers look at the booty with amazement. The officer does not believe that we have crossed the Volga. He thinks we were dropped by parachute as scouts. We got to the POW camp together with the prisoners from the newly defeated Northern Cauldron. The next stage was the assembly point in the village of Dubovka, 50 kilometers north of Stalingrad. There I witnessed mass deaths. From February to June 1943, about 30,000 German soldiers were buried in mass graves. Hunger, winter, and weakness, it was easy for typhus to do its work. It was beyond the Russians' power to hold nearly 100,000 prisoners. The couple of surviving railway branches were used for the needs of the front, and it was very difficult to organize the transportation of what was needed in the steppes. The fact that I was among the survivors I owed to my frostbitten feet. I was brought to a kind of infirmary. I was then 23 years old, weighed 42 kilograms, and was to spend 7 more years in captivity. First a camp for captive officers, then a labor camp, road building, and a quarry. As an officer, I was immediately separated from my soldiers. They went to other camps, and I never saw them again. I think they probably died in captivity. 7 years later, in December 1949, I returned home, the only surviving officer from my infantry regiment.